when I saw that Alabama beat Georgia, you could see that there was likely going to be an issue for the playoff committee. Because if Florida State won, which they did, congrats for getting past Louisville 16-6 and winning the ACC championship game, you could see emerging a really difficult decision for the college football playoff committee. 12-1 Alabama, 12-1 Texas, or 13-0 Florida State. Pretty much unanimous agreement that 13-0 Michigan and 13-0 Washington were in. The question was, what is the analysis? How should they break things down? And I laid out on Saturday, as soon as the Florida State game was over, why I believed the final ranking should be number 1 overall Michigan, number 2 Washington, number 3 Texas, and number 4 Florida State. Number 4 Alabama over Florida State. And I laid out exactly why I believed that was the right result. Michigan, Washington, Texas, Alabama, and ended up being right. And that was, at the time, evidently considered to be a controversial opinion on the college football playoff rankings. Because I got in bed right after I did that show, and FanDuel had hung odds, and they had Florida State to make the playoff at minus 800. And I hope some of you jumped on after I shared this, because you could get plus 550, I believe it was, or plus 525 odds that Florida State wasn't going to make the playoff. I said, go hop on this. I shared it with you all. I said, I think this is a bad number. Ended up being correct. Alabama gets in over Florida State. I think it's the right call. And I'm going to use an analogy here for you that is like 20 years in the past. What the College Football Playoff Committee did is not remarkably outrageous. In fact, college basketball has been doing it for the NCAA tournament for a long time. And I'll give you a prime example. Kenyon Martin was the best player in college basketball. This is probably around the year 2000 or so. Somebody can look up the exact year. The Cincinnati Bearcats, for much of the year, were the number 1 team in college basketball. And then Kenyon Martin, I believe it happened in the tournament that year. Kenyon Martin broke his leg, and he was out for the rest of the season. And as a result, Cincinnati went from what would have otherwise been the number 1, I think they were going to be like the number 1 overall team, certainly a number 1 seed. And if I remember correctly, the College Basketball Committee dropped them all the way to a 4 seed. And there was some grumbling about that, some disappointment, but people understood that Cincinnati, with and without Kenyon Martin, who was probably the best player in college basketball that year, was a massive difference to that basketball team. And they went from around the number 1 overall team to somewhere in the neighborhood of a 4 seed, which means they would have been seeded somewhere between 13, 14, 15, or 16 best team in college basketball. And then Cincinnati went out and lost either a first or second round game. I don't remember which one. And their season ended. And a lot of people said, you know what? The College Football Playoff Committee got it right. Now, Florida State had the opportunity after Jordan Travis was injured against North Alabama. They had the opportunity against Florida and against Louisville to demonstrate that their team was basically the same with or without Jordan Travis. In other words, they had an opportunity, just like Ohio State did in 2014, to demonstrate that they were actually one of the 4 best teams in college football. Tate Rodemaker got injured, sack backup. He wasn't very good against Florida. Completed less than 50% of his passes. Yes, Florida State won, but anybody who watched that Florida State rivalry game saw that Florida State was a substantially diminished team. Then he got a concussion, and he was out, not able to play. They brought in their 3rd-string quarterback, and the team suffered significantly. There was, at least in my opinion, a touchdown difference, which is a huge amount of overall talent, a touchdown difference between Florida State with and without Jordan Travis. That's just the reality. And so I don't believe Florida State, based on what we saw in the game against Florida and the game against Louisville, deserve to be ranked among the 4 best teams in the country. Now, here is where I think the College Football Playoff Committee could have adjusted things a bit more. They could have dropped Florida State after the Florida game outside of the top 4 and said, we need to see more from Florida State in the ACC championship game in order to believe that Florida State is still a top 4 team. Probably would have made a little bit of sense to do so. But I think they got the top 4 teams, given the circumstances, correct, because it's always about balancing most deserving and best. Now, the reason why I'm wearing this Georgia shirt is not a lot of talk about the Georgia Bulldogs. Georgia was the overall number 1 team in college football coming into the final week. They lost to Alabama by 3 points in a neutral site game, and then dropped all the way to number 6. So the College Football Playoff Committee said, after watching an entire regular season, we are convinced the Georgia Bulldogs are the best team in college football. Then Georgia loses a tough, hard-fought game against Alabama by 3 points in a neutral site venue, and they drop all the way to 6? If anything, the team that actually has the most gripe, in my opinion, with the College Football Playoff Committee is Georgia, who, by the way, opened as a 14-point favorite in the Orange Bowl over Florida State. Now, I'll talk about Georgia a bit more in a second, but a big part of my argument on Friday was, who would Michigan rather play? If you let Michigan players, coaches, and fans all vote, would they have voted to play Florida State or would they have voted to play Alabama? In fact, there's video of Michigan reacting when Alabama is announced as their opponent because Michigan has been whipped solidly by the SEC every time they've played basically an SEC team in the Jim Harbaugh era. So early preview, I think Alabama is going to beat Michigan. I believe the line is like Michigan minus 1.5 or something like that. I think it'll be a low-scoring game. I think Alabama will beat Michigan and advance to the national title game. But to me, that's kind of dispositive. Now, if you went solely with best teams, everybody can get fired up about this. When it gets clipped, you can get fired up reacting to it. If Vegas were analyzing the 4 most talented teams, it would be Alabama, Georgia, Michigan State, and Ohio State in no particular order. Those are the 4 best teams. But the course of the season is a balancing act. So if you only wanted Vegas to rank teams, then actual outcome wouldn't matter at all. Some people got fired up about this. Oregon lost as a 9.5-point favorite to Washington on Friday in the Pac-12 title game. And some people said, oh, this proves how wrong Vegas was. Not necessarily. Washington has won 2 games by 3 points, but Oregon could easily come back if they played another week and win game 3 by double digits. In fact, even though they lost the first 2 games, Oregon would be favored in game 3. And a lot of college football fans don't understand this because there aren't very many rematches in college football. So people think that whatever happened in the one game would just happen over and over and over again throughout history. Look, I think if Georgia played Alabama 100 times in the Georgia Dome or Mercedes-Benz Stadium or whatever it's called down there now, I think Georgia would win 55 or 60 of those games, and I think Alabama would win 40 or 45 of those games. I think if Oregon played Washington 100 times, I think that Oregon would win around 60 of those games and lose about 40 of them. People have this idea that probability doesn't exist in football because college football in particular, rematches are rare, but actually rematches happen all the time in every other sport, and the outcomes are wildly divergent. Think about the NBA or Major League Baseball or the NHL. That's why we have a 7-game series, because a team can win or lose a game by 30 points and still lose the overall series. Look at what happened, heck, in college football, what feels like years and years ago now. Oh, what year was it? Like 2012, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Alabama lost at home in overtime, 9-6, if I remember correctly, against LSU in a 1v2 matchup. I was at that game. It was called the Game of the Century. Phenomenal atmosphere. LSU, Les Miles, they came on the road. I think it was the 2011 season, if I'm not mistaken. They came on the road, and LSU won that game at Bryant-Denny Stadium. Then they rematched in the national championship game. 1 versus 2. It was Alabama against LSU, and LSU didn't even cross midfield, and Alabama destroyed them. What changed? Same 2 teams. Alabama lost at home by 3, and then I think they won the national title game like 21-0 against an undefeated LSU team, and LSU didn't cross midfield. Alabama came back from losing the earlier game and absolutely dominated against LSU in the national championship game. Now, again, I was there sitting in the upper recesses of the Superdome. That was so wild, if I remember correctly, and I think I do. That game was so wild, and New Orleans was so wild. I was out that night on Bourbon Street. LSU and Alabama fans everywhere. I have never seen a crazier environment in my life. My wife was down there with our oldest son, and I actually told her, I think it's the only time I've ever said it. I said, don't go out with him after dark. That's how crazy it was in New Orleans. Alabama, LSU fans everywhere, mass drunkenness, pure bedlam. I said to my wife, do not go outside after dark. The streets here are too crazy. When this game starts, it's going to be too wild. Just stay in the hotel room with I think it was like our 3 or 4-year-old at the time. That's how crazy it was. So that's what happens. Sometimes you get rematches. Somebody wins and absolutely smokes the team that they lost to earlier. Florida State was not a top 4 team. College football playoff controversy continuing to grow. There are comments that Florida politicians are going to investigate and all these other different things. I understand why Florida State fans are upset. I also understand why politicians that represent many Florida State fans in the state of Florida would be upset as well. But I don't think there's any grand conspiracy here. I think the College Football Playoff Committee looked at Florida State, looked at what they did against Florida and Louisville with a second and third string quarterback, and made a rational decision. As you can see, Georgia has opened as a 14-point favorite over Florida State. Now, early prediction. I think Alabama's going to beat Michigan, and I think Texas is going to beat Washington. That would mean you would have 13-1 Alabama against 13-1 Texas. If I am correct, Florida State might end up, if they could pull off the upset, beating Georgia and being the only undefeated Power 5 team in major college football. If that happened, could you make an argument to the AP that you deserve to be the overall number 1 ranked team? I think you could. I don't think they would accept it, but I think you could go full Central Florida route, have your own parade, proclaim your team a national champion. This is the last time that I believe this would ever be possible, because next year we go to a 12-team playoff. We just had Congressman Byron Donalds on. I think if you said, okay, hey, here's the deal. We're going to have Washington and Michigan get byes. 3-seed Texas plays against 6-seed Georgia, and 4-seed Alabama plays against 5-seed Florida State, and we do a 6-team playoff this year. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. So, to me, I wish we had the ability to solve this issue. I would have expedited the 12-team playoff a year early, but just play 2 extra games. give those teams a bye, Washington and Michigan, play three-seed Texas against six-seed Georgia, and four-seed Alabama against five-seed Florida State. I think that Georgia and Alabama would win those games, personally. And I think you'd end up with Georgia and Alabama going up against Michigan and Washington. You know what? I actually think Georgia-Alabama would end up your national championship game, which we just saw in the SEC championship game.